The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition to the Canadian Tree Fund webinar series. My name is Alex Martin, co-chair of the Canadian Tree Fund, and I'm pleased to be joined by Rich Hauer and Ryan Gilpin for their presentation, ISA's Best Management Practices for Construction Near Trees. Starting off with Rich. Rich is the Director of Urban Forestry at CNUC and a Professor of Urban Forestry at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. He was honored in 2018 with the L.C. Chadwick Award for Arboricultural Research from the International Society of Arboriculture. Rich has published over 190 publications and presented over 480 talks throughout the world. Pleased to be joined by Rich, and then in short time, Ryan. Take it away, Rich.
Hey, thank you very much, Alex. Hey, my pleasure to be here today. I want to first start out by just making some references to how we got started on this project. And we updated the ISA best management practices for trees and construction. And, kind of at the start of this, we were addressing definitions, and surprise, surprise, not everyone uses the same terminology. So for example, you'll be hearing things today where we talk about the tree protection zone, which you might actually use critical root zone. You might use critical root radius. There's a lot of different words that kind of convey the same thing, but just bear with us and you'll hear some terminology maybe that's slightly different how you use it, but kind of the end result is the same. The other thing is process matters. That's another theme you'll be hearing today. And for example, if you look at trees construction, there's a lot of reasons and explanations of why trees fail after a construction process. And usually it's just not one factor. Often it's multiple stress events where it could be piles of soil, where you get oxygen deprivation, or maybe mechanical damage to stems, soil compaction, just a slew of potential things. Healthy trees, maybe be able to tolerate it. Less healthy trees, perhaps less so. And you can see from this decline spiral that Nelda Matheny and James Clark came up with, it really explained this process pretty well. The other part is policy matters. Take a look at this picture here. It may look like just a pile of soil. Actually, when I saw this pile, it looked like a pile of snow. And in this particular town in central Minnesota, what's going on here is the city had a trees and preservation ordinance. A local hospital wanted to cut the trees down for a parking lot. And the city said, no, you can't. We have a protection of trees during construction process. But what they didn't have actually was where you place the soils during construction. And unfortunately, these piles of soils, within a year later, these trees died, except for the one at the very periphery. Now, usually trees don't die that quickly. Usually it takes a longer period of time. And that's where we can think of like science matters. In this case, you'll be hearing some science themes today here. Here's a really good study from Dr. Susan Day and her PhD advisor, Dr. Nina Bassick, where what they're actually looking at here was from the literature, how often does it take for trees to actually die from the construction process? And what they found was usually it's a longer period of time, usually within a decade, and they found typically between 2 and 8 years from the literature. But trees can even withstand even longer than that. Here's a case in California, the state of California, where we could use the concept of time matters. In this case, actually, over a century. In this case, it's a Cypress ACA member tree. In this case, if you're familiar with giant sequoias, they're really resistant to decay. In this case, the tree was tunneled through 125 years ago before it eventually failed, in this case, during a windstorm. Now, was the wind the factor that caused it to fail, or was it the construction impact that occurred 125 years ago? I'd say perhaps a little of both, but perhaps setting the tree up for failure. But the key thing here is some trees can take even a longer time period to succumb from a construction event. Now, sometimes the plan said, in this case, here is a transformer, and the plan said, well, it needs to go at this particular location. And the good thing here is this person potentially had a stump grinder, a buddy that had one. And so anyways, you can certainly modify plans. So the process and the science in the planning process, you'll hear themes today from Ryan setting up a really good scenario of how actually trees and construction and the planning process doesn't start when the plans actually are let out. It occurs a lot sooner during the entire planning process. Now I'm going to give you a little background of work I've been involved with since the 1990s. That actually looked at trees and construction, in this case, in the city of Milwaukee. The city forester at that time, Bob Skira, got a call, and it was like, hey, Bob, just want to let you know that several of my constituents are not happy. They can't get to work today. One of your trees is on top. Now, during this time period, to prevent damage to sidewalks and curbs, the typical process was to sever root systems. And perhaps you've seen these machines, Vermeer, they're not grinders, but they're root cutters. And they just go down from one end of the street to the next, and they'd cut roots right at the interface to the sidewalk. Yeah, it actually does an effective job at cutting roots. It also does an effective job at increasing the susceptibility to failure from reduction of tree root system. Now, we could also look a little bit further. If you're interested in this work, we've actually published on 3 different time periods that I'm going to talk about briefly next on this whole process in Milwaukee of looking at the planning process and actually getting trees at the very beginning during the whole trees and construction process of how to actually avoid damage. And this is a paper that we published. If you're interested in it, just email me. You can Google me at UWSP and use my last name, Hauer, so H-A-U-E-R, UWSP. You'll get my web address and I can get the paper out to you. Now, when I got involved with this project, we could look at trees and construction. So 1978, the previous image, that tree failed. The city of Milwaukee had a tree inventory. So fortunately, we were able to put trees into control and construction things. But before any of the construction occurred between 1981 and 1985, these 2 subsets of trees that were later on subjected to construction or not had no difference in condition rating, which is kind of nice when you start a scientific study. Well, in 1989, I got involved of analyzing a data set that was developed, and what we found was, surprise, surprise, if you do construction near trees and you don't think about the biological needs, you can have a major effect on the health. In this case, actually, the condition rating using the Council Tree and Landscape Appraisers approach, where you look at the root system, the stems, the scaffold branches, twigs, and foliage. And I remember telling my dad about this. I was a young lad doing undergraduate research at the time, and he kind of shook his head, kind of scratched his hair a little bit and said, well, son, I could have probably told you without spending any money that if you damage trees, they're more likely to be in a lower condition rating. The nice thing, though, is we actually had a percentage, about 6%. And the nice thing is this whole thing set into place, this trees and construction process, where over the time period between the early 1980s to the present, they put in place a very effective program. And so by the mid 2000s, you could still detect perhaps a little effect on reduction of condition of trees and construction zones, but today in the present, there's no difference. Now, we can't actually compare 2018 to 2005, because in this case, these trees had a lower condition rating because of ash anthracnose and other foliar diseases that year because of the wet spring when we did the follow-up investigation. But regardless, what you see is this trend of trees become less impacted by construction as the plan gets implemented. Now, the other thing which is kind of interesting is if you look at trees and survival, yeah, in the past, you could actually kill trees at a higher rate if they're in a construction area. As time progressed forward, no difference in the mid-2000s. And now in the present, actually, we found a statistical difference that you actually have greater survivability of trees in construction zone. Now, yeah, you're probably thinking, if I was a consultant, I said, hey, the best way to make trees survive in your community is do construction nearby. Well, when I first saw this number, it kind of made me scratch my head going, where do we goof up? Because this doesn't make any sense at all until we start digging into the data a little bit further. And then if we control for things like sidewalk distance to the curb and several other factors, there is actually no difference in survivability. The trees survive the same in construction zones and outside. It's actually, streets get widened. In this case here, the streets actually shrink slightly. And so here's a tree root. Here's where the old curb was. And the whole process here of removing the old curb and putting a new one in is they avoid damaging the root system. The other thing is what is actually going on is the trees have more growing space. So actually in the construction area, they're avoiding damaging the trees and they're giving more growing space. So that in itself is explaining why trees actually have a greater survival rate in these construction areas, which is kind of fascinating. Now, if you're really curious, and in the case here, if you look at comparing between a sidewalk width to the curb at about 60 centimeters as a base to where you have about 300 centimeters of distance, you have about a 3 times greater odds of survivability, which actually is a fantastic thing. Yes, it certainly is a no-brainer that if you have greater growing space, you have greater health or greater survivability. But this is just an implication with some data to give you some odds ratio from our research. Old practice was this: if you told someone to remove the curb and you didn't give a specification of how to actually do it, you can certainly remove the curb in this case and also damage roots. The current process is the specification is don't damage the root system. Oh, by the way, if you do, or if you damage the stem, or if you cause other damage maybe to the canopy, it's $100 a diameter inch. Okay, so put it in perspective, this is US dollars. For every 2.5 centimeters in diameter, it's 100 US dollars. Now, another part of this process was working with contractors to actually modify equipment. In the case here, this is just a typical curb installer, and by default from the factory, they need about 28 centimeters of distance from the end of the chute to where actually the concrete's laid down. And Jim Kringer, who is really the brainchild behind this whole trees and construction process, asked the question, why do you need 11 inches in US or non-SI units? And they said, well, that's just the way they are. And they've actually since modified these things, so they only really need about 2 centimeters. Again, this whole trees and construction program here, you can look at when they had no program in place pre-1979, and it built over time to the point between 1979 and 89, we could think of it kind of limited implemented. Again, if you'd like this table here, or if you actually want to write all this down, it'd be on the exam later on today, is the program just didn't start, by flip of a switch, you have the best program in place. It actually took time to build. It took about 2 decades from that perspective, but you could use the program that developed in Milwaukee for your own good. Now, we're going to take a little deep dive here into some science, and we're going to look at some studies that actually looked at how close you can get to trees before maybe it's too close for either tree failure or maybe a physiological measurement. So one physiological measurement we can take is water potential. And this is nothing more than the Scholander pressure bomb. If you've ever had the opportunity to operate one of these, and you actually put a stem sample here with foliage in this chamber here, and you use the amount of pressure to actually see where water comes out, for example, the stem or the petiole of a leaf. And it's an old process. It's been around for about 100 years, this concept of water potential measurements. So it's a really good physiological measurement. Or you could spend about $50,000 these days and get a LICOR portable photosynthesis machine to look at gas exchange. So here you're looking at either stomatal conductance, water vapor going out, or actually measuring the carbon dioxide intake coming into the leaf, or actually respiration rate for that matter. Another way is we could look at whole tree failure. So we're going to actually look at all 3 of these as we look at trees and construction. Now, before we dig into that though, I have to bring this slide up because when I first saw this slide that Dr. Susan Day put together for a literature review for the International Society of Arboriculture, it was really fascinating that if you look at tree roots, and there's a lot of studies using small trees, and if you only went up to, let's say, about 10, 15 centimeters in diameter, you have this really linear, where from the stem of the tree, it's almost a linear relationship. But as trees get bigger, it becomes curvilinear, which is really fascinating. And it kind of makes sense because every time you double the diameter, you actually have a 4-fold increase of surface area on the ground. So if you think from that perspective, for every inch a tree goes out, it's a 4-fold increase of surface area that roots have to explore. Now let's look at this first paper from Dr. Alessio Fini from Italy. And actually we could look at the case of using pre-dawn water potential, where the lower the number, which they're actually negative numbers, so 0 would be lower, negative 0.2 would be a much more lower number. And the lower it gets, the more stress. And this is an indication of in the morning. So pre-dawn, before the sun comes out, and this is a really good indicator of how stressed a tree is. Now, if you're curious, is 0.6, 0.7 going to cause the death of the tree? Probably not, but it's just one more of those factors. If you threw de-icing salts down, along with severing the root system, along with soil compaction, all these iterative things could cause mortality of the trees. In this study here, none of the trees actually died as far as from my memory, but certainly they could detect an effect. And there's also difference in tree species. So they used one of their Tilia European hybrids and also compared that with the horse chestnut. And typically when the study was first implemented, yeah, if you had controls versus on one side versus at 2 sides, and by the way, these were 4.5 times the diameter. So if it's a 10 centimeter diameter stem, that would mean that they're 45 centimeters away from the tree trunk. And over time though, it took only about 2 years where you actually had no difference and actually statistically in pre-dawn water potential in the case here for Tilia Europa. But in the case of horse chestnut, Hippocastanum, yeah, they could actually still detect some difference 3 years later for those that were severed on both one side and on 2 sides. Same thing here, we could look at water loss or CO2 uptake, and same trend kind of applies here. With Tilia Europa, yes, you could see a difference between 1 and 2 sides versus controls, but over time, it kind of washed itself out. where it took, in this case, about 3 years, where there was typically no difference. In the case of horse chestnuts, there were. So the bottom line here is at 4.5 times, which is actually pretty close. You'll hear we talk about 6 to 18x later here as Ryan gets rolling with his presentation. And I'll bring that concept up also myself. We can look at actually resistance to failure. In this case, their study, the higher the number, the more force it is taking before the tree would fail. So in the case here, the bending moment, you can look at on no sides where it actually took statistically more force to actually have it bend for 1 degree of leaning. And that's just a typical measurement point that is done in studies like this. And so the bottom line is those that were severed on one side and for sure on 2 sides were much easier to pull to failure than those that were not. Now let's look at another set of studies from Dr. Andrew Benson and then his colleagues, Dr. Andrew Kozer and also Dr. Justin Morgenroth, where they actually looked at 3x, 6x, 9x, 12x, 15x in an intact root zone where there was no severing that occurred at all. And they're comparing again here the physiology, and also they looked at some resistance to failure. So in the case here, the first thing, pre-dawn water potential again, days since root severance actually occurred. In the case here, control trees, the less negative the number, the less stressful. And by the way, it's typical trees do not get to 0 at pre-dawn water potential. Trees that are fully hydrated might be a negative 0.1, a negative 0.2, so just put it in perspective. But the closer you are to the tree or the further away you're from the tree versus the closer you were to the tree, more water stress compared to the control. Now, again, you're wondering, is 0.5 something that's going to cause failure? Likely not. But the neat thing here is there's times where you have to get close, okay? Here, from data like this, I would say water management after the construction process of root severing occurs is quite vital. The other thing they looked at is total root cross-sectional area. And so the bottom line here is the closer you get to the tree, the more cross-sectional area. Now, the intriguing part of this to me is one thing we do know from work with biomechanics is if you look at this cross-sectional area of a tree stem and the branch parts that come off of that parent stem, cross-sectional area is equal. And this was actually been known for quite some time, going back to Leonardo da Vinci, who mathematically, who demonstrated this through his science and his art work. What we do not know is actually what does 300 square centimeters of cross-sectional root area actually mean relative to how much is actually needed on a diameter inch basis. So that's actually something that is being explored actually in the future. Another study, the same end result. It's certainly is the closer you get to the tree, the more cross-sectional area that is actually then exposed. Now this same study, again using some pre-dawn water potential. And the case here is if you look at getting really close to the tree, is still over a year later, you can detect some pretty significant stress in a tree that's pretty tolerant of trees in construction. In this case, it's actually live oak. And so perhaps you're not familiar with that species, Quercus. That's typical in the southern United States, Quercus virginiana, but it's a pretty tolerant tree. It's a pretty tough tree. Now, the last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Ryan here in a couple minutes, is if you look at tree stability and root cutting. Now, from the ISA BMPs, they make references to kind of a 5x factor, where if you start getting closer than that, is your risk for structural root zone damage could be great enough where the force it needs to topple over, it's much like that case in the city of Milwaukee where trees were falling on top of cars after a windstorm. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. It wasn't that these trees just toppled over after the root severing occurred. It was actually after a microburst, so a dawn burst, and they had something like in the 70 to 80 mile an hour wind speed, which is not an uncommon wind event, by the way, in the Midwest. Perhaps you experienced these up in Canada, but where I grew up in Minnesota and now in Wisconsin, these micro downbursts are quite common in the summertime. And so 5x. Now here's a study with willow oak, which is also a tree root system that's quite fibrous, and they're relatively closer to the surface than another species I'll talk about here in a little bit, Pinus member. But if you look at the force, in this case, Dr. Tom Smiley, they were able to get within 2x before statistically they had less force that was needed to actually topple the trees. In this case, actually, again, putting it to 1 degree of leaning is their measurement that they're using. We can look at another species, red maple. Now, red maples, if you're not familiar with those root systems, they're more oblique, so they go down at an angle. In this case, they could get within 1x before statistically they had a reduction in what they called the standardized force. You can just think of this as it's easier to topple a tree. And then they looked at Virginia pine, another species. Now this one is notorious for having a taproot. And so in this case, the taproot system was giving greater stability, and they could actually get up to the trunk before statistically the force to actually topple it over was similar to the non-control trees. So on the home stretch here, what does science say? Well, give you some evidence from just typical physiological water potential and gas exchange, and also trees to failure are all important things to think about in the context of trees and construction. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan next, and he's going to be getting his presentation loaded. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and during the interim, if I have any questions there for me, happy to take them. And
Fantastic.
are you able to share now, Ryan?
Yep, I'm getting set up
Awesome.
over here. You go ahead and answer a question or whatever you want to do from there.
Rich, there's one question in the chat about could you add your email address for people to send you questions
Sure, I'll
about
just
the
add it
paper?
back in the chat. Perhaps that'll help people.
Sounds good.
All right. That was
Alex,
an easy question to
am I
handle.
set up correctly here? Does this look right?
Yep, you're all good. Sweet. Well, thanks, Rich, and then we'll transition over to Ryan. So, Ryan, thanks for joining us. Ryan is the principal consultant at Nidus Consulting in Portland, Oregon. Ryan's background was in ecology with degrees in environmental biology and international nature conservation. Ryan's the co-author of 2 best management practices, the tree care for birds, wildlife, BMPs with the Western chapter, and ISA's managing trees during constructions. Well, I'll turn it over to you, Ryan. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks, Rich, for talking to us about the really important science that we used to write the new version. So the 3rd edition of the Trees and Construction Best Management Practices are going to be coming out in the next month or so. So let's talk a little bit about some of the more practices and more things that I use from them to approach them, because there's going to be some pretty significant changes in the new version, and we want to just give you all a little bit of a heads up as to what's coming and help you navigate some of them a little bit. So I do quite a bit of training of new consultants in offering these services, and I interact a lot with my clients. And so I start thinking about, like, what questions do I get asked, both from people who are trying to figure these new services out for the first time, and from my clients and projects that I'm working on. And so we could spend all the time on any one of these questions. We could try to do, a quick smattering of all of these questions, but I think what we're going to do today is focus on the question, is the tree likely to survive construction? And in the new best management practices, there is this table where we sort of show the 6 stages of construction, phases that we go through during the process, right? So we start in the planning phase, then we go to the design phase. The pre-construction phase is pretty quick before the construction phase starts. Then we do sort of landscaping and post-construction. And often I'm involved in all or many of these different phases, which is a little bit unusual for arborists and sort of how they get involved into this stuff. And I could get asked, is the tree likely to survive construction in any one of these phases? But the most common time, the time that I sort of spend the most on this, is during the design phase in what we call the tree impact assessment. And so in the new edition, in the 2nd edition of the best management practices, the older one, it never once mentions plan review and never once mentions this tree impact assessment. So this is a new thing that we've added that I think is really important. And so I'll give you some language that's going to be in the new version here of using the site plans and knowledge of the tree resource. The arborist evaluates which trees can be preserved and which should be removed or transplanted. It gives you a little bit of insight about how to do that by evaluating how the trees near the limits of construction will respond as the site is graded, utilities are installed, foundations are excavated, and buildings are constructed. So this is sort of a potentially new responsibility that you all may not have been taking on or aware of in navigating the old best management practices. And now that we're going to have this in there, I want to try to give you some tools, a little bit of insight into how I go about doing this. And the best management practices sort of in nature are very theoretical. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to make this a little bit more practical, a little bit more applicable to some actual trees and actual projects. So this is an actual project of mine that I did in the last year. And there's a couple unusual things about this project. I typically work on more sort of urban redevelopment projects. And this is a little bit more of a natural area, natural-ish area with sort of this new construction being built. And often when you have a project like this, you identify the sort of limit of grading and say that everything within this area is going to be removed. And the question is to what's going to happen on the outside of this. And so on a really densely forested site, the question starts being all about stand dynamics, right? Of as you remove trees near the edge, what happens to the other trees there? This isn't a very densely forested site. This is a site that's got sort of more individual trees. And so we're going to treat them more as individual trees than as a forest or a stand or something like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom up on this upper portion here. And so across the top, we have our property line. And then we have these sort of vertical lines, which is our topography, right? If each one of those is a foot in elevation. And then we have our edge of grading, which is our dashed line across the middle here, where our gray lines sort of bend. We can see that our topography is going to change there once the site is graded. We're going to take big equipment and sort of move that area there. And so we'll again show that this is the area below this line where we're going to have sort of pretty significant destruction. And then it looks like we're building some sort of parking lot on this sort of northern edge of the property and have some trees that are going to be planted afterwards. Now, this isn't the actual project, but just to give you an idea of what this might look like, we have sort of this, total destruction by our large construction equipment with a fence right along this edge of grading, and then all of our trees that we're trying to preserve beyond that. So we have maybe at least one more really important thing on this plan here. These sort of little gray dots are accurately located trunk locations. So on most of my projects, civil engineers or surveyors go out and plot on the plans exactly where these trees are. And so it's my job to sort of relate those points to my data so that I can figure out which of these trees are which and how they're going to be impacted by construction. So the first thing I do, the first thing I advise the new consultants that I'm training is to go through and figure out which trees are going to survive and be removed, like very clearly. What's very obvious? Tree number 4, not going to make it. There's going to be big bulldozers coming right through this area. That tree is going to be removed. Tree number 1, pretty dang far from construction. I think that we're going to say that that tree is probably going to be fine. And so that we've narrowed it down now to just trees number 2 and 3 that we're going to have to work through here to try to figure out what's going on with them. And I know what everyone's thinking. Is there any way that we could just put some pretty long, complicated definitions into this presentation to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? So as Rich said earlier, I'm not trying to tell anyone what they should be using in terms of terminology. In particular, I try to use the terminology that the city that I'm working in, the area that I'm working in uses. But in sort of my mind, when we're trying to figure out whether a tree is going to survive construction, we are talking about the critical root zone. And this is the definition that we use in the new version of the best management practices. The critical root zone is the area of soil around a tree where a minimum amount of roots considered critical to the health of the tree or structural stability are located. So we'll have a couple of different definitions here and sort of compare to them. But if we look at this tree on the right here, the idea being this tree has many roots in this sort of large area. And as Rich showed us earlier, these trees can survive some amount of root loss. And as we get closer to the trunk, we are less certain that it's going to survive that, because then we might be getting within this critical root zone. And that this is a biological limit, right? This is not, we can calculate it based on this formula or anything like that. This definition is just that it's the amount of roots required for the tree to survive, and it's up to us to try to think about what that might be. So if we take that definition and we bring it back over to our construction plans, the next thing that we do is we measure the distance between the tree and our construction. So here I've measured the distance between number 2 and construction at 3 meters, and number 3 is 4 meters from construction. So in trying to figure out whether or not tree number 2 is likely to survive construction, I then bring in my information from my tree inventory, right? I went out there, I looked at the tree, and I said, it's an Oregon ash, 45 centimeters in diameter. It's in good condition. I've rated it as low suitability for preservation. This is a little bit of a challenge here because emerald ash borer just arrived in Portland. Well, it's been here a while. We just discovered it six months or so ago. And so I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do about that, but that doesn't really relate to what we're focusing on today. And it has a dense crown and good structure. So at this point, I have enough information to decide whether I think this tree is likely going to survive construction. And I can't really tell you how I do that or give you a good way to do that yourself exactly in the way that I do, because I was trained in the Hort Science system, right? So when I started working in Hort Science, there was over 100 years of experience in sort of the mentors and leaders of the company. And so I would go out, when I was getting started, Nelda Matheny would sit down with me and we would look at the project and we would go and assess the trees, and then we would look at the construction plans, and then we would go out and watch them complete that construction and talk to them about that. And then we would see what the root loss would be, and then we would see what the tree looked at the end. And over the course of about a year, I did this with, you know, almost all of these different consultants in this photo, and started seeing the decisions they were making, started seeing how the trees were responding on their projects. And after about a year, I was pretty comfortable doing this myself. And then a few years later, I started doing that with other consultants, right? I brought in other people to show them how I was doing it and allow them to sort of build up this expertise over time. We do not have a year today. We have about 20 minutes now to create some sort of system to give you some idea of how you might do this. If you have, some people on this call likely have more experience doing this than me and don't need my help, and you should just continue doing what you're doing if it's working well. For those, some of you have good mentors and people that can show you the details of how they do it and you can learn from them. I recommend doing that. That's the best way to do it. If you don't have either of those, I will give you some ideas I have about how you might go about starting to think about this. And while I said that the critical root zone is what I think is important, we're going to need to jump forward a little bit in order to sort of give you a little bit of a framework. And so let's talk about the tree protection zone. So the tree protection zone is an area within which certain activities are prohibited or restricted to prevent or minimize potential injury to designated trees, especially during construction or development. The TPZ should be bigger than the critical root zone based on the judgment of the arborist, right? So the tree protection zone should always be big enough that the tree is likely to survive, in my opinion. And so the tree protection zone should be bigger than the critical root zone, and we should be protecting as many of the roots as we can, and the trunk and the canopy and everything else. But we're rarely in a situation where we get to make the tree protection zone as big as we want. We're often in a situation where, hey, construction is happening here. The question is the tree going to survive? And so Rich talked about a lot of really great science. One of my favorites is this Benson paper. And in particular, I really like this graphic here, right? So this is just showing us in a color-coded way of the closer we get to the tree, the more concerned we are about it dying, right? So if we had let's say a 1 meter diameter trunk, then we're looking at 3 meters, cutting 3 meters away, 6 meters away, 9 meters away, whatever. And so if I can stay 15 meters away, if I can do whatever from that tree, I think I'm happy. If I'm cutting within 3 meters of a 1 meter diameter trunk, I'm not only worried that the tree is not going to survive, I'm worried that the tree might fall over, right? And that was some of the research that Rich was showing us. And then in this middle zone, I'm sort of uncomfortable, right? And dark orange, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. And sort of this greenish yellow, I'm feeling like, oh, a little less uncomfortable. And then that's pretty good. And so that's how I think about it. I don't think there's this fine line of like, we need to be in this area for this tree to survive. I think I get more and more and more nervous the closer we get. And that's always related to the trunk size, the diameter of the tree. So if we look at tree number 2, and what we were saying is that it was 3 meters away from our construction, and it has a 45 centimeter trunk. That gives us a TPZ multiplication factor of 6.7x. Okay, this is the first time I've ever done this specific presentation in metric. I'm pretty comfortable using metric, but let me know if I have any of this math way wrong. So I said that I really like this paper and I think it's really useful, but let's look a little bit more at the details of that. So the main takeaway of this paper is the tree protection zone needs to be 15 times the trunk diameter as a minimum to avoid the negative effects of water stress. And this is where I normally make the crowd interact with me, but that's a little harder to do today. So I'll just walk us through the 3 things that I think make this paper difficult, or we might want to consider more factors than what we're showing here, based on some of the research that Rich showed and some of my experience. So the first is that this paper is saying to avoid the negative effects of water stress, and that's not what I said we're doing. We're looking at the likelihood of survival, not avoiding negative effects of water stress. And so I think that those are similar, but not exactly the same. So we want to keep that in mind. One of the main things I see in the research, and especially in my experience, is that species are highly variable in how they respond to construction. Rich mentioned that Quercus virginiana is very tolerant of construction impacts, and a lot of our research involves Quercus virginiana, so I think that that's one potential problem there. And I'll add in one more of, we find that age variation matters a lot, that young trees are generally easier to preserve. They tolerate more root loss than older, more mature trees. And so when we bring in all of these three things into what we've focused on here, we get into what we are now calling the calculated tree protection zone. And so this is not a new idea. This table has been around for a long time. We've just adapted it a little bit, but this is a new definition of the calculated tree protection zone is a TPZ that is calculated using the trunk diameter and a multiplication factor based on the species tolerance to construction and age of the tree, right? So we finally have something tangible that somebody with not a ton of experience in this can make a rough calculation as a starting point to figure out what might be an adequate tree protection zone for this tree that we're working on right here, right? And so so I'm gonna bring this table into what we were working on before here. And so Fraxinus latifolia, in my experience, all Fraxinus have high tolerance to construction damage in all the places that I've worked. But I really have mostly worked on the West Coast. I've worked a little bit in Ontario, a little bit in Florida, and some other places that might be somewhat relevant here. But I think that what's most important is that you all, rather than thinking of Fraxinus latifolia, Oregon ash, are thinking about in your area, what has high tolerance to root loss / construction damage. And so that might be box elder, Acer negundo, that might be Acer rubrum, red maple. Find something in your area and be thinking about that tree in place of this Oregon ash, okay? So it has high tolerance to construction damage. A 45 centimeter Oregon ash, I could sort of go either way. I'm gonna call it mature. It could be semi-mature, depends on what sort of area you're working on. That gives us a multiplication factor of 8. And so in the Benson paper, this graphic that I've got below here, they've basically said that 15x is what we should have for every tree. But based on our calculated tree protection zone, we think that 8x is probably pretty good for this tree. And so that means that what we're going to do is we're going to adjust all of our color coding across the bottom here, so that when it was 6.7x, and that was sort of a darkish orange, I was saying, hey, I'm pretty concerned about this tree. I'm not sure if it's going to be able to take up enough water to survive a hot, dry Portland summer, right? You got to know about your area. You got to know more about your site, your trees, than I know about what you have going on. So in sliding this over, we're now thinking that this 6.7x isn't so bad. It's actually a light green here, and that it's really up to you all, up to the arborists, to decide whether they think that their tree is likely to survive construction. But in this case, this light green means that I think that we're pretty good here. I think that this tree is likely going to survive this construction. Okay, so we're going to do one more example here. Tree number 3 is a Populus tricarpa. Looks like I spelled that wrong, so that's fun. A black cottonwood with a 60 centimeter diameter trunk. It's in fair condition with low suitability for preservation. It has a thinning crown. It's got codominant trunks with included bark. We've got some problems here, right? We said that it is 4 meters away from construction and a 60 centimeter trunk. And so that gives us, again, 6.7x, convenient when the math works out that well for us. Again, we're looking at sort of this dark orange that we're a little bit concerned about. And in the Portland area, I would say that black cottonwood has a low tolerance to construction damage. And so again, think about something with low tolerance to construction damage, right? I don't know all of these trees all that well in your area. We're looking at sort of these more natural areas. So maybe you have some Thuya occidentalis, maybe you have some Tsuga canadensis. So think about what trees work for you, and you can even maybe respond in the chat or let us know what trees you see as having really high or low tolerance to construction damage in your area. But anyways, I'm going to keep talking about the black cottonwood. And so a 60 centimeter trunk, I would say, is in this mature to over mature to old range, whatever we want to call that, because it's also declining in health. It has a thinning canopy, things like that. So I'm going to put it in as old and say that that's 18x, right? So when we compare 18x to 15x, I actually want to shift the colors on my scale here the other way, where we're saying, ooh, hold on, 6x on a tree with low construction tolerance that's old, that's actually not sort of a dark orange, that's a dark red. And even more than that, if you look at the best management practices and you read what it says for table 2, it says that these multiplication factors are really designed for trees in good condition. And so a tree in fair or poor condition, you might even want a bigger tree protection zone if you're trying to save those trees. So if we bring all of our information back in here, we can say for trees number 2 and 3, we think we've made some decisions, right? I'm not telling you what you should do for tree number 3, but what I'm thinking is that that tree is likely not going to survive construction. And tree number 2, I think, is going to survive construction probably pretty well. If we can do anything to preserve more of the roots, great. But I think that it's likely going to be fine with what's planned right now. Now, for tree number 3, saying that it's not likely to survive construction doesn't mean that we're necessarily condemning the tree. There's all sorts of different options to do from here, right? We could redesign, we could do some exploratory root trenching, we could do all sorts of other things. And this is just the first step in being able to do that, in being able to say, hey guys, I think we have a problem for tree number 3. We either need to plan on removing it or doing something else. Let's talk about it and let's figure out how we can come up with the best plan together for this project. So I have a little pause point right here, and so I can leave this to the group of, do we have quite a few questions, Alex, or should I talk about something related but a little different for about another 5 minutes here, and then we'll jump into questions?
Another 5 minutes would be good. There's no questions in the chat yet.
So most importantly, get in there with some questions, because otherwise you're just going to have to listen to Rich and I like tell jokes for the last 5 minutes, and we're just not that funny, you know? Okay, so let's look back at our questions here. And so one thing that I think often gets sort of mixed up or linked together in weird ways is our question of how likely is the tree to survive construction with how well we protect the tree and complete construction. And so this is also happening in the design phase and often gets us sort of confused, right? So this is the next one, the next step in my mind, right? So we've decided that tree number 2 is going to survive construction. We've gone up to our table and we said that 8x multiplication factor is what we think we need to preserve this tree. I see a lot of arborists do the math, right? They say, okay, you need 3.6 meters according to the table. That's this circle here. Put a fence up right there and don't let any construction happen within the fence, and the tree is going to be fine. But they've forgotten the second part of my question is and complete construction. So one of two things is going to happen here. Either they're going to take down the fence and do whatever they want, which is a problem, or they're going to not be able to build their project how they have it designed, which is a problem. And so there's many ways to sort of solve this, but we've of course offered you another definition to help you with this. And that's, we have our calculated tree protection zone that we were just showing you there and use the table for. And then we have the specified tree protection zone. I very rarely am actually protecting trees using the calculated tree protection zone. I'm much more often using a tree protection zone that is adjusted in size or shape to accommodate the existing infrastructure, plan construction, and specific aspects of the site, while also taking into consideration tree canopy conformation, visible root orientation, size, condition, maturity, and species response to construction. So a lot of the things in our calculated tree protection zone are the sort of last things in this definition, but we're also taking in other things to account, right? So when we come back over here, rather than having that perfect circle that's 8x 3.6 meters, what we're going to do is cut off our little circle just short of the planned construction. We're going to put up a fence here along this pink line, and we're going to sort of say, hey, we think that this pink fence is going to protect not just tree number 2, but also tree number 1. And then typically we write some sort of specification, something that says, this is what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. In these sorts of situations, it's relatively straightforward. You can do basically anything you want outside of the fenced area, and you basically cannot go inside the fenced area. If you do have to go in there for whatever reason, contact me and we'll talk about it. This is like a little, I'm not able to do that on most of my projects. On most of my projects, we are doing something where we have to get a little bit more creative, and it's a little more complicated than that. And I'll just show you real quick here that like this is one of my average projects where we're building in these sort of already built out urban areas, and some of this stuff doesn't work quite as well that I just showed you work quite as well in these areas because we're often doing construction pretty close to large trees, and it starts getting much more complicated. In the chat, there's a little handout that has some of these definitions in there and some of the other information for those of you who want access to that before buying your own copy of the best management practices, because in the next month or so, they'll be available on the ISA website, and I'm sure everybody wants to run out and get a copy for themselves and start using some of the new pieces that we have in there. Okay, Alex, what do you want to talk about from here? I'm going to stop sharing my screen unless there's anything in particular you wanted me to show.
That's all good. We got flooded with a bunch of questions here. So
Great.
The first one, we'll kind of try and move in order. Rich, you talked briefly about wind throw. Are most of the papers that we see coming out on these, on the construction impacts of trees related to individual trees? Like, are they studying a tree that's in isolation and the effects of construction? Or is there anything that's starting to get into like forest fragmentation or group trees where we might see wind throw dynamics shortly after removals?
Yeah, on the papers I talked about, these are not at the edge of woodlots. In many cases, they're actually in the urban environment already. These are more likely actually trees that were planted. And so from the perspective of, tree windfall, because you've opened up an area and the biomechanics of the tree was in a totally different environment. No, that's not the case. These are trees that were pretty much exposed to wind on all sides or on much of on the canopy, if that helps.
I suspect, Rich, there's quite a bit of research in traditional forestry, sources with that. Have you looked at any of that much? I've never really dug into it.
I've looked at it, but not enough where I could say, be worried about this situation. On the case of trees and construction, I'm not aware of much work that's actually gone from a scientific basis on the edge of woodlots, as much as there's certainly literature on there in the trees biomechanics. All of a sudden you open up the edge of a forest, or I should say you remove the edge and you start exposing those in the interior, and you've got trees that start leaning and are certainly, from anecdotal perspective, seen it myself, that are more prone for toppling, with moderate to more than that for wind loading.
Yeah, definitely focus on that if that's the project that you're working on. Those can be a really big deal. Absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm sure you've seen this, Ryan. You open up the edge and all of a sudden you get the tree that just basically starts leaning over.
Yeah.
Which in itself is an issue. I think it comes even more so. I love the question because it really comes at the aspect of maybe using the knowledge we have, someone could actually come up with, maybe Alex yourself, of looking at kind of the taper of a tree. Is there a certain taper threshold? Or maybe that's something that could be put in the 4th edition, Ryan, taper threshold of concerns for wind loading effects. So
yeah, great question. What else we got, Alex?
We'll speed through them here because they keep on coming. One of the ones that might be quick is, what do you suggest for tree removal once they're deemed to be removed? Bulldozer or cut down with a saw?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I think most of my projects, most of the trees are removed with a bulldozer with some sort of heavy equipment. But the main concern with that is if you have trees that you're trying to preserve relatively close to them where you think the roots are interwoven, it's pretty obvious choice that you should not be pushing those over.
Great, thanks. Next question. Person asking this question tends to do root trenching, like exploratory root trenching on every site. Do you think that's necessary?
I can speak from the urban environment. It's situational. I think more so it's like how close are you getting to the tree, and more so can you actually avoid damaging root systems. There's good examples I can think of, like trees near between the curb and the sidewalk. You have to do some utility installation. There's a way to put them underground rather than actually trenching. And there's, in Wisconsin, for example, there's several communities now that have actually come up with ordinances that it's up to the contractor. They have to actually do the exploratory work if they want to put installation of utilities at that location.
Yeah, I think there, absolutely. I think there's pros and cons of doing it, and that a lot of it is related to the regulatory structure and like situation of your project. So in a lot of my projects, this construction is happening, and the question is, will the tree survive or not? In which case, I think that exploratory root trenching has its limitations, and that the other main option is we, during the construction phase, are doing the excavating, and I'm there on site, and I say, hey, it's time, we got to remove this tree. And in some, you can set that up so that that works really well, but that creates its own challenges of, some cities you need a 30-day waiting period to like notify the public and all these things. And so, yeah, there's pros and cons of doing it. I don't do it on every one of my projects. If other people have success doing it on every one of their projects, that's great for them.
I think Ryan brought up an interesting point there, though, is you can also think of this as private versus public. I imagine on your projects, Ryan, it's really a cost benefit scenario, whether it makes sense to do the exploratory work. The situations I was talking about were in the public sector, where the residents of the community own the trees, and the contractor is having granted permission to use the right of way for utilities. So it's up to them not to damage the public good in this case, which would be trees.
Let's find a related question. Oh, here's a good one. Can you talk about how to speak about kind of trees and construction protection with other design and construction professionals?
Yeah, when I train new consultants, there's like a couple of pinch points, and this is one of the biggest ones. How do you talk construction? How do you like, we're very accustomed to talking about other arborists or with our clients about trees. And pretty quickly, it turns into a totally different conversation with designers and architects and planners and engineers and all sorts of different people. And so this is like everything else. I just built up this sort of specialization over the course of a year, listening to my mentors do it and trying to mimic them. And I don't have a lot of other advice except that being able to speak their language and interact in their world rather than asking them to come into our world is what we find most successful. And besides that, it's going to be complicated. And I'm happy to talk to more people about specifics around that.
Yeah, I think Ryan hit on it. It's basically learn how to speak contractor or learn how to speak architect. If you don't understand their language, that's a challenge, as much as obviously you're trying to educate on your terminology and language. And I can still think of a friend of mine, Jeremy Barrick, when he became one of the deputy foresters in New York City, and he was starting the trees and preservation program, where he learned how to speak architect by learning CAD. And so he realized he could actually give a flash drive to an architect, here's the tree layer, and they'd get that. He could speak to them about tree protection or critical root zones and all the terminology, and it'd go in one ear out the other. But a flash drive with CAD layer was the secret sauce there.
Is there a general depth to adhere to when you're excavating underneath trees?
I think you've done more of this than me, Rich, right?
No, I actually haven't. I don't think there's really, we're talking about tunneling underneath a tree, and that I don't know of any papers out there that have actually looked at from a science basis of how close can you get to the surface is really what you're getting at. That's getting back to that earlier question of actually really using air excavation tools to create a tunnel to then actually sever from below up above. Not an easy feat. Great question.
I guess agreed, this is a great question. And I'd probably answer it the other way of saying, knowing the soils in your area is probably the biggest factor in this. And that, so most of my training was in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we rarely found roots deeper than 18 inches. I'm going to struggle, half a meter, because it was sort of this compacted urban clay soil. And then, but it varied a lot place to place. And then here in Portland, the soils are much deeper and much more opportunity. I'm finding roots down, 4 or 5 feet, a meter and a half. And that's sort of a little bit new to me. And I think generally when we're that far down, we're not hitting enough roots to kill the tree. So part of the question is like, how are we impacting stability and things like that in the same sort of way as everything else? We're just going to sort of provide as good of recommendations as we can and then see what we find, either through exploratory methods like Rich said, or through monitoring the actual work.
But I'd add one additional thing is, I think from just a practical basis of boring tools that are out there, that from my observation, there doesn't seem to be an issue. That, yeah, you're damaging some part of the root system itself, but if anything, it really is not a major effect. But don't quote me on that, but just observationally, and it's certainly, you're minimizing the amount of damage compared to using a trench or excavator. So,
and increasing price a lot. Often the reason this doesn't happen that often is because it quadruples the price or something like that, right?
What's interesting is, Ryan, I imagine you're coming from a private perspective where it could be a lot. And coming from a public a public situation where major miles or major kilometers of lines are being put in, actually boring is less expensive than trenching because of the backfilling. But I think there's that mobilization of equipment cost up front. But once it's there, the boring equipment tends to be in the Midwest less expensive than actually trenching.
Well said.
Yep.
I'm cognizant that we're 12:01 here, but there's 2 more good questions. First would be, so we talked about changes in wind dynamics briefly there. How about light dynamics? You remove trees. You're now next to perhaps a glass building, perhaps a building that's providing shade. Can you speak to how that affects tree condition?
I think you'd have to take the Silvix into consideration. What is the tolerance of the tree to begin with? To these lights and actually the reflection, that's a great one. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not really determined until after the fact. I don't know about you, Ryan, is the glass that's put on a building, the exterior part, usually part of the initial planning phase?
No, I mean, yes and no. Sometimes you get really in-depth plans pretty early on, but most of the time, no. I remember very clearly one time there was a lot of money in sort of transplanting an olive into this courtyard that had reflective glass all around it, and it just got cooked. And so I know that this is an issue. I think, all these questions are all sort of like, how and should you account for this? And the answer is yes, and it's complicated, and we're always trying to do our best and don't have enough information to like predict it with 100% accuracy, right?
We very similarly had an issue last year, 2 years ago in Manitoba with the highway development that they, not necessarily a building with glass, but they cut away trees to push back their road allowance. And within a period of like a week, all these poplars showed sun scald right across the side of the highway for a 4 or 5 kilometer extent. Fine now, but they went through a year or two of noticeable stress. Last
So there's Alex, I'll just say one more thing. There's all sorts of examples of sort of edge effects, like you said there, of understory plants struggling when their areas are getting dried out. And I think you can get these areas dried out both through sort of minor changes in hydrology and through new sort of solar radiance. And so it's just really complicated. It's hard to, we're doing the best we can, and it's almost impossible to incorporate all this information, but we're trying to do as much as we can.
The last question here kind of gets a time frame, it's kind of long term. So it seems like a good place to close it on down after this one. At what point do we consider likelihood of survival in relation to a given time frame? So we know that a tree might commonly survive, but look and recover poorly, if at all. Obviously, a 6-month time period versus like a 10-year time period is quite distinct. Is there some metric to qualify the term survival rather than succeed or meet life expectancy?
You've had a lot of really intelligent, great questions. This is maybe
They're
the
not my
most
questions, to be fair.
I'm complimenting the Canadian audience here. This is maybe the most cut through, all the BS question right here. Dr. Hauer, how do we answer this question?
Oh, here it's like, is a tree surviving biologically versus I wish that tree was not there, I think is really the heart of this question. How much is it dead before it's really you consider it a loss? I look at 10 to 30% or less of any impact on the overall canopy of success. Trees have enough redundancies that they can tolerate some reduction. As you start getting beyond 30%, I start getting concerned. It also depends if it's a conifer, gymnosperm versus an angiosperm. Angiosperms can tolerate a little bit more than the gymnosperms can. But yeah, I'd look at less than 30% of thinning of a canopy as perhaps a success.
Yeah, I'll take this on like a weird route maybe. So a lot of my experience and training is sort of around these methods in which the project ends and we rarely go back and look at the trees. That's just sort of the dynamic of our relationship with these projects. And so I think I've seen some inklings of some studies that are going to look at this more. And I've heard anecdotally a lot of like, well, trees decline 4 to 6 years after construction, things like that. I don't have any way of testing that. I don't have any real experience or expertise built up around that. And I think that so Rich, at that, Alex and Rich and I were all at the ASCA conference together, and there was an amazing presentation on tree ring research. And I suspect that there's going to be some great tree ring research trying to answer some of these questions about survivability and like loss of vigor and different things over the course of construction projects looking 10 years back or something like that. And I suspect we'll have some more interesting science to lean on. just like the science I said before of like, it helps us answer some of these questions. It does not answer these questions for us, but it'll give us some insight into it, I think.
Yeah, and I just add to what Ryan said. I think using the advice that Ryan's presentation talked about, we're going to start avoiding actually this question anyways, of how many years before you consider it a non-success. I think following the guidance that's in the new BMP, you're going to start avoiding this question to begin with. It's the cases where construction occurred where due process is not given in consideration of the construction needs and the biological needs of the plant is where we really even get into, is it 5 years, 10 years from now, 10 to 30% thinning of the canopy too much?